This lesson examines how students communicate their own ideas regarding a concept or issue for a particular audience. Communication is at the heart of all human interaction. In the 21st century, developing technologies have created new opportunities for communication that is spoken, written, visual or multimodal, in print or digital forms, and with broader reach and fewer barriers than ever before. In contemporary communication, the active process of communication is often seen as being as important as the end product. Nevertheless, digital capture and publication of even informal communications mean that those products persist longer and disseminate wider than ever before. All future roles need to be able to communicate clearly and persuasively with a variety of audiences and subjects. As a result, the need for effective communication is no longer confined to language classes and journalism careers. It is important for students in all areas of academic study and in future roles that range from office worker to lawyer to scientist, for them to be able to communicate clearly and persuasively with a variety of audiences and subjects. There are different ways to communicate and a range of skills which need to be developed in order to communicate effectively. The clearer we are about how we want our students to communicate their ideas and how this communication should be shaped for different audiences, the better. This will inform the design process and will also help us to define the type of skills that are necessary to develop in order to communicate effectively. We need to ask ourselves questions about the opportunities we design for students to communicate their ideas regarding a concept or issue, how they support this communication with evidence, and if their communication has been designed with a particular audience in mind. Answering these questions will inform the design process for the learning activity. Perhaps it would be useful to break down each of these questions. This skilled communication rubric examines whether students are asked to produce extended or multimodal communication and whether the communication must be substantiated with a logical explanation, examples or evidence that support a central thesis. At higher levels of the rubric, students must craft their communication for a particular audience. Twenty-first century communication can take many different forms. For example, as part of a learning activity, students may have a discussion with a peer over Skype. In this rubric, we don't focus on informal classroom talk, whether face-to-face or electronic. Instead, we focus on activities that require students to articulate their ideas in a permanent form. A presentation, a podcast, a written document, an email. A performance, for example, a skit or an oral debate would also be considered in this rubric. We recognise that less formal conversational media are also very important aspects of communication. However, effective uses of Skype will have an outcome related to the learning goals of the activity. For example, do students produce a summary of what they've learned through Skype or build that learning into the final product that they are creating? So what this rubric does is evaluate the skilled communication requirements of the product or outcomes of the student's work. Is the communication extended, multimodal, substantiated, and designed with a particular audience in mind? To begin, what do we mean by extended communication? Extended communication is required when students must produce communication that represents a set of connected ideas, not a single simple thought. In written work, extended communication is the equivalent of one or more complete paragraphs rather than a sentence or phrase. Whereas in electronic or visual media, extended communication might take the form of a sequence of a video, a podcast, or a slide of a presentation that connects or illustrates several ideas. However, a single text message or a tweet is not extended communication. If students are engaged in electronic communication, this is only considered extended communication if it produces an outcome that requires students to connect the ideas they have discussed. For example, producing documentation of what they've learned or the next steps for resolving an issue that arose. The duration of an electronic chat is not considered in evaluating extended communication. Think about these situations and consider if they require extended communication. Is extended communication required when students host a webinar where they present on different topics about their city to peers in their sister city and then answer follow-up questions? Is extended communication required for when students solve a geometry problem but do not write any proof? Do you think extended communication is required when students participate in a webinar where they listen to presentations by peers from their sister city and then ask follow-up questions? Is extended communication required when students write a letter to the editor in response to a recent news article of their choice? Do you think extended communication is required when students hold a Skype conversation with peers from another school to create a plan for the performance they will put on together about the novel they have just read? If students write an extended proof to demonstrate the solution to a geometry problem, does this require extended communication? Is extended communication required when students hold a Skype conversation with peers from another school to talk about the novel they have read? Now that we've considered if communication is extended, let's think about the form that the communication takes. We need to think if the communication is multimodal. Communication is multimodal when it includes more than one type of communication mode or tool used to communicate a coherent message. For example, students might create a presentation that integrates video and text or embed a photograph into a blog post. In addition, the communication is only considered multimodal if the elements work together to produce a stronger message than any one element alone. If the learning activity offers students the opportunity to choose the tool or tools they will use to communicate, we consider it to be a multimodal communication opportunity. Now think about the following situations to determine if the communication is multimodal. Is the communication multimodal when students create a print, radio or television advertisement for their new invention? The learning activity is designed by the teacher to allow the students choose what type of media they wish to use. Is communication multimodal when students produce a podcast on a hurricane for their journalism class, including a written script and the final audio podcast? The story is the same whether written out in the script for the podcast or spoken in the podcast. Are the different media used to enhance the content of this communication? If students create a radio advertisement for their new inventions, but the learning activity does not offer students any choice regarding the type of media, is this communication multimodal? If students write lab reports about their science lab on density of matter, including narrative text and visual evidence of what the students saw in their experiment, for example drawings or screenshots of real-time data displays, is this communication multimodal when the learning activity requires multiple modes of media to work together for a more complex description of the experiment? Is this communication multimodal when students produce blog posts on a hurricane for their journalism class, including a written description of the conditions and additional audio or visual media? The learning activity requires multiple modes of media to add depth to the students' descriptions. Is this communication multimodal when the learning activity requires students to write lab reports which include just narrative text about their science labs on the density of matter? In a journalism class, students produce a podcast on a hurricane, including a written script and the final audio podcast. However, the story is the same whether written out in the script or spoken in the podcast. This is an example where the multimedia are not used to enhance the content of the communication. Now, what we would like you to consider is how could you redesign this learning activity so that the students have a multimodal communication opportunity. We would encourage you to join the discussion to share your views and ideas about this task redesign with others. Let's move on to discuss another idea about developing skilled communication skills, which involves supporting evidence. Communication requires supporting evidence when students must explain their ideas or support their thesis with facts or examples. The evidence should be sufficient to support the claim that the student is making. In this instance, a thesis is a claim, hypothesis, or conclusion. Students must have a thesis when they are asked to state a point of view, make a prediction, or draw a conclusion from a set of facts or a chain of logic. Now I want you to think about these situations and consider if the learning activities require supporting evidence. To begin with, if students write an essay about why global warming is a problem, will they have to state and defend a claim about global warming? Will this require them to provide supportive evidence? If students must describe the derivative of a mathematical equation and explain the logic that brought them to this conclusion about the equation, is supporting evidence required? Is supportive evidence required when students must write a blog post about the main themes from Alice in Wonderland with examples from the story to illustrate their point? If students must derive a mathematical equation and compute the equation without explaining their logic, is supportive evidence required for this type of communication? In this example, where students must write a journal entry from the perspective of a slave describing their daily life with historical accuracy, do students have to state or support a perspective? If so, do they have to provide supporting evidence? Is supportive evidence required when students write an essay about global warming? Will they have to state and support a claim, hypothesis, or conclusion? Or in this situation, can they complete this activity by providing just a set of facts? If students use Microsoft Community Clips to video themselves solving a mathematical problem, including both the steps they took and their reasoning, does this learning activity require the students to explain both their process and their thinking? Is supportive evidence required when students use Microsoft Community Clips to video themselves solving a mathematical problem and stating the steps they took? The students are not required to narrate their reasoning process, so do they have to provide supportive reasoning? Consider this learning activity, where students must write a journal entry from the perspective of a slave. They must describe their day with historical accuracy. However, the learning activity as it's currently designed does not require students to state or support a perspective about their imagined life. Now, what we would like you to consider is how you would redesign this learning activity so that the communication does require supportive evidence, and in such a way that the students must explain their ideas or support their theses with facts or examples. We would encourage you to join the discussion to share your views and ideas about how to redesign this task. So far, we have discussed extended communication, multimodal communication, and supportive evidence. Now we will discuss the final idea about developing skilled communication, which is focused on students designing their communication for a particular audience, when they must ensure that their communication is appropriate to the specific readers, listeners, viewers, or others with whom they are communicating. It is not sufficient for students to be communicating to the general audience on the internet. They must have a specific group in mind with specific needs in order to shape their communication appropriately. When they are communicating with a particular audience, students must select the tools, content, or style that they use to reach that specific audience. They must be required to consider what tools the audience have access to or use on a regular basis, the relevant information they must present in order for the audience to understand their thesis, and the formality or informality of the language they choose in order to be appropriate to that particular audience. To qualify for this idea, the learning activity might specify a particular audience, or students might select their own audience. It is ideal but not essential or always possible if the communication will actually be seen by that audience. When designing learning activities, the requirement is that students have the opportunity to develop their communication with that audience in mind. For example, students might develop some type of activity to teach younger children about how to divide fractions. They will have to decide what medium to use to reach those students, for example, a podcast or a game. In addition, they also have to consider what type of language and content the students would understand and relate to. This satisfies the requirement even if the podcast or the game is never used by the younger children. Many teachers find that it is useful to specify an audience of a different age or background than the students themselves. This highlights the need to think about the audience they are communicating with, what they will and will not understand, and also what they might find interesting. Think about the following situations and decide if the students are required to design their communication for a particular audience. Students must create a video about their school using appropriate imagery and evidence to welcome the incoming students. To do this successfully, students must design the video to help the incoming students feel welcome and enthusiastic about attending the school for the next school year. In comparison, if students are asked to create a video about their school using appropriate imagery, etc., is there a specific audience or purpose for this video? Are they required to design their communication for a particular audience? Now consider a situation where students must write a letter to a company suggesting improvements to a product. Will they have to consider the arguments and perspectives that will be most compelling to that company? Are they communicating to a particular audience? In this example, students must do a rocks and minerals science project. The learning activity requires students to communicate a central finding, include rock and mineral samples, narrative text and/or audio information. Students then have to submit the project to the teacher only. Do they have to consider any particular audience when working on their project? Look again at the learning activity where students must do a rock and minerals science project. The learning activity requires students to communicate a central finding, include rocks and mineral samples, narrative text and/or audio information. However, the students had to submit their project to the teacher only, so they did not have to consider any particular audience. Now, what we would like you to consider is how could you redesign this learning activity so that the students are required to design their communication for a particular audience. For example, students could be asked to design a rocks and minerals exhibit for the town library. The learning activity would then require students to communicate a message through the exhibit, which must include rocks and mineral samples, different media presenting information to capture the visitors' interests, and take-home pamphlets for exhibit visitors. So by redesigning the learning activity in this way, students have to design their communications to be appropriate for a particular audience. We would encourage you now to join the discussion to share your views and ideas about other ways to redesign this learning task. In this lesson, we have discussed some of the big ideas about skilled communication and what it could look like in the classroom. In the next lesson, we will introduce a framework which outlines the different types of skilled communication and examine how this framework could be used to help design learning activities to develop your students' capacity to communicate skillfully.